The Oriskany that I served on, she's now in some Pensacola, Florida. The last carrier I served on is the Nimitz, which is the last active duty carrier, and it's going to be retired later this year. But anyway, it's a real pleasure to be here. You know, we used to have our Midway docent recognition dinner over here, and I really enjoyed it. For some reason, they moved it back to the flight deck on Midway, which is not near as well. And I've told my bosses we need to come back over here, but they don't listen to me anyway. But it is a pleasure to be here. You know, we have about 450 docents over on Midway. About half of them are actually active. About half of those actually do something, but that is until you have something free. Like once you have free dinner, or the docent mixer with free shrimp, well, all of a sudden they come out of the woodworks. You Paul probably relate to that. But anyway, the Battle of Layte Gulf was the last great fleet operation of World War II. It involved some 282 ships. Now these are just the ships that were involved in the battle. Does not include those amphibious ships involved in the landings. If you added those in, it'd be somewhere in the 600 ship range. 200,000 sailors, over 100,000 miles, and some of the most biggest and powerful ships went to the bottom of the ocean, and thousands of men, and the exact number is unknown. You know, the Battle of Layte Gulf, though, tends to be less well known than any of the other battles. And to explain that, I need to go back and review some of the early battles. First of all, the Battle of the Coral Sea was the first carrier battle in history. You know, was considered a tactical victory for the Japanese because the U.S. lost more tonnage some. But it was considered a strategic victory for the U.S. because Japan did not achieve their objective of taking Port Moresby in New Guinea. Had they done that, they would have isolated Australia and maybe left her open for possible invasion. And the Aussies still remember the battle. They have a Coral Sea celebration every year, and they know how to celebrate down in Aussie. Next came the Battle of Midway. You know, it decides the U.S. victory, of course. Four Japanese carriers went to the bottom. And from now on, Japan would never be on the offense. They would be on the defense, and the U.S. would determine when and where battles would be fought. Then we get the major battles for Guadalcanal. This was considered started on a shoestring. Now, all the Allies had agreed that it would be Europe first. We needed to defeat Germany first. Admiral King, the chief in operations, though, wanted to maintain some offensive capability in the Pacific, and he was given that opportunity when the D-Day landings were delayed, and he was able to start something down in Guadalcanal. Now, it's well documented the horrendous conditions under which the Marines lived on Guadalcanal, and nightly bombings by airplanes and ships, and the battle which they fought. But what is less well known is that for every Marine lost on Guadalcanal, over 3 sailors were lost in the waters off of Guadalcanal, what became Iron Bottom Sound for the 48 ships sunk there. Then came the final carrier battles. By this time, you can see the number of carriers. Our industrial base had kicked in, and the Japanese were having trouble. But this was, officially the Battle of Philippine Sea, better known as the Marianas Turkey Shield. Some 400 aircraft, over 300 Japanese went down. So it was a decisive U.S. victory. So why is Leyte Gulf less known? Well, that's because of these others. By this time, the U.S. Public, they were used to us winning. They expected us to win, and so there weren't the headlines that there had been. But what if the Japanese had been successful? What might have been the outcome? Well, it wouldn't have changed the end of the war. They were going to lose, but it might have delighted us by several months. But the biggest thing was political. Roosevelt was in running for his 4th term. The balloting would begin in about 2 weeks, and if we had lost, obviously his opponents would have seized on that. And some historians suggest that it might have had he'd have to back off his demand for unconditional surrender and settle for a negotiated peace. Now there are 2 options before the Battle of Leyte given. Admiral King, the chief of naval operations, he was well known for his temper. His daughter described him as the most even-tempered guy she had ever known. He was always in a rage. But his option was purely military. He wanted to bypass the Philippines and go to Formosa. At that time, we still assumed that we were going to have to invade Japan, and he thought with Formosa we'd have bases to start the bombing in Japan. We could also stabilize the situation in China and have bases there too. Now, General MacArthur had 2 sides to his, and MacArthur's first was military. That by taking the Philippines, we would shut off their supply of oil. And that was a real problem for the Japanese. In fact, at this time, our submarines had been so successful that they had to move a lot of their fleet down in the Singapore and the Borneo area to have access to oil. And that was fine, except then they didn't have ammunition, which had to come from Japan, so it was long. They did keep all their carriers up in their primary anchorage in the inland sea in southern Japan. Now, the other side of MacArthur's argument was moral. He said we had that the Philippine people had forgiven us when we had to surrender there, but they continued with their guerrillas to take a toll on the Japanese. As he said, even if we tried and failed, they would forgive us, but if we bypassed them, they would never forgive us, and it would send a really bad signal throughout all of Asia. Now, Admiral Roosevelt came out to Pearl Harbor. He summoned MacArthur there. MacArthur didn't want to come. He thought it was a photo op for Roosevelt's re-election, which may have had some truth to it. But anyway, Admiral Nimitz presented Admiral King's option. MacArthur presented his option with that moral obligation. He also added that there are a lot of POWs being held in the Philippines, including quite a number of nurses in Manila, and we had an obligation to rescue them. So MacArthur's, his carried the day. Now, Japanese Navy forces, and they fight north-south and so forth. I'll just talk about the leaders of their Ozawa. It looks like he had quite a few carriers up there, but only one of them, the Zuikako, was a large carrier. She was the last one from that attacked Pearl Harbor. The others, these small light carriers, and these battleships were called hermaphrodites because they were so hard up for carriers after the Battle of Midway that they took the turrets off some of these old ships and put on a flight deck. Now, they could only launch, they couldn't land, but that was kind of okay because most of their pilots were not well trained enough to land on a carrier. They could only take off. And the pilot training also been dealt another blow because Admiral Halsey's carriers had attacked Formosa, and the Japanese sent most of their airplanes from both the Army and the Navy down there, and they lost almost 500 airplanes. And they also lost a significant number of pilots. Now, the Japanese planes were designed for performance, and pilot survivability was never a consideration in the design of this. And the other thing that Halsey did, he had come across some information from the guerrillas in Leyte that it was not nearly as heavily defended as the intelligence estimated it had been. And so he recommended that it be moved up from 2 months from December to October. And that gave Ozawa even less time to train his pilots. So this was really a decoy force. Ozawa figured he was not going to come back. The plan was for him to be located and lure Halsey's carriers to the north out of the battle. Now, the center force down there, Admiral Kurita, and this was actually their major force that they hoped to get into Leyte Gulf with. You can see the two battleships. Two of them were the largest, most powerful in the world, number of cruisers. And he was going to, there's only two ways you can get to Leyte Gulf. You're approaching from the west, the San Bernardino Straits to the north, and now I forget the name, I'll get down here to the south. So they had planned a pincer attack up there. Now, initially, Kurita was actually had this southern force of Nishimima in his, but they were old at World War II, really slow, and so he detached them to come through the southern Surigata Straits, and it was really as much of a decoy as actually being able to attack because he figured that would pull him away from them. Now, the second stranding force actually had to sail out of Formosa all the way down there. Now, Nishimura and Shima did not get along. They had been rivals for years. They didn't like each other. They didn't talk to each other. And Nishimura, he had earned his admiral stars for sea duty. He had a lot of sea duty time. Shima did not have near as much. He was more of a shore duty sailor. So they did not combine them. Had they combined them, Shima would have been in charge and would have been the less qualified. And they didn't even have direct communications between them. So they didn't like talking to each other at all. Now, as far as the U.S. naval forces, you had Admiral Halsey there, 9 large carriers, the small carriers, almost 1,100 aircraft. His large carrier, he was split in 3 groups of 3 carriers apiece, and you can see almost 1,100 aircraft in there. Now, the battleships, New Jersey was his flagship, so that's where he hung his flag in there. 7th Fleet with Vice Admiral Kincaid, and he was in charge of the landings on Leyte Gulf. He had with him the 18 carriers of Taffy 1, 2, and 3, which would play a significant role in here. In charge of that was a Rear Admiral Sprague. He was in charge of Taffy 1, all the Taffys, but he was embarked in Taffy 1. Taffy 2 was a Rear Admiral Stump, and in Taffy 3 was another Rear Admiral Sprague. They had the same spelling of the name. They'd been classmates at the academy, but they were not related. And of course, you can see the number of all the other there. Now, Admiral Ollendorf is going to play a major factor in this. Now, The Japanese named it show for Operation Victory. So it was a bonsai type of suicide charge. They were going to do it or die trying. And it was this pincer attack. Now that requires, precise timing and communication, something that would be a problem. And the Army was not at all in favor of this. So, and the Army and the Navy were finally talking to each other. They hadn't done that the whole war. They didn't like each other. So in this case, the Army said, well, if you send your fleet in there and it's sunk, then it'll leave the home islands unprotected. But Admiral Toyota, the chief of the Japanese Navy, said, please give the combined fleet a chance to bloom as the flowers of death. Now, as you might guess, this wasn't really popular with the Japanese sailors that were going to have to do this. In fact, they asked some pertinent questions like, why isn't Admiral Toyota, the head of our Navy, who is, whose plan this was, down here leading the charge? Instead, he was safely tucked away in his command bunker in Yokohama. And also, the Japanese samurai warrior code said that warriors attack other warships. They don't waste their time doing things like protecting convoys and supply ships, which is one of the reasons that our submarines had a heyday with theirs. Now, the communications were a problem for both. As I mentioned, the Japanese, they had unreliable equipment, but for both, it was overloaded of the communication circuits. They were so badly overloaded, and the U.S. especially, and so those that had lower priority messages would up their priorities on it until everything was top priority. And that would result in the really critical messages being delayed sometimes 2 or 3 hours, and they would sometimes come in out of sequence, so a lot of communication there. And also there's no direct communication between the two fleets. Admiral or General MacArthur would not allow direct communications. He didn't trust the Navy. He had to have it routed through his communication facility, and this would slow things down considerably. Now MacArthur was a brilliant man, but it was said of him that the only thing bigger than his IQ was his ego. There are actually 4 separate naval major engagements in the Battle of Layte Gulf. None of them were actually in Leyte Gulf. So why do we call it the Battle of Layte Gulf? Well, because General MacArthur called it Leyte Gulf. That's what MacArthur wanted, he usually got. So the troops began landing on October in 44, and this is when they're most vulnerable. This is when the Japanese would like to have struck. So as you can see, the ships are all grounded, so their stationary targets are not mobile. You've got all the troops bunched up ashore, and of course all the supplies are stacked there on the deck. So this is when they would like to have struck. And this is also when MacArthur wades ashore. And somehow there just happened to be a microphone set up there, which he grabbed and said, people of the Philippines, I have returned. Yes. And this, he'd made the promise 2.5 years, I shall return. Now, if you notice MacArthur, it's always I, it's always the first person. Beside him, behind him there in the helmet is the President of the Philippines. But apparently he wasn't worthy of being mentioned, MacArthur never liked to share the same limelight. Now, Kurita's center force started out way down south, and he was coming, anyway, this narrow little island that there is Palawan Island, and it looks like you actually have a pretty wide area there to come through, but that's not the case, because on the other left there is called dangerous ground. It's uncharted, it's rocks and shoals, and it says mariners beware. So they actually had a fairly narrow passageway through there. Now, sitting at the fourth end of that island were 2 submarines, the Darter and the Dance. And it was a dark, overcast night, but they picked the Japanese up on their radars. So the Darter set just to the left side of the Japanese columns, just north of the island, Palawan Island there. And the Darter was further north on the other side. So when the cruisers first came into range of the Darter, she fired all 6 forward tubes, and then turned around and fired 4 at the second cruiser. 4 of those at the first cruiser hit her, and Admiral Kurita, that was his command ship. And he quickly realized what they're in, and he told the captain, it's time to go. He took off his shoes and jumped over the side. And by his own admission, he was the first to abandon ship. Now, the second cruiser took several hits from the Darter, and she would have to retire, and they would send 2 destroyers with her to go down. And then the Japanese turned to the right to get away from the Darter, and they ran right into the Dance. So the Dance fired at the next cruiser and put her down. So before she even got into the San Bernardino Straits, she was down. 2 cruisers sunk, 1 damaged, and 2 destroyers headed back with her. Now Halsey was on the other side, and Halsey initially thought that the Japanese would not really defend against Leyte Gulf. However, he shortly realized that was not true with the reports from the two submarines. Sent out some scout planes. They located Kurita's force, launched their carriers against them. They heavily damaged one cruiser, and they sent one of the largest warships in the world, Musashi, to the bottom. And about 4:15 in the afternoon, then, or a little earlier than that, Kurita decided he had enough for a while. He turned around, withdrew from the area, sent a message back to his bosses that they were temporarily withdrawing to try to regroup and get out from under there. Now, the Japanese had also had land-based planes, both Navy and Army, to attack the U.S. fleet. Now, they had been promised, Kurita had been promised some air cover, but because there were few airplanes, that never materialized, really. Those in charge of the airplanes thought they'd be better used attacking Halsey's carrier. So in this battle, Commander David McCampbell downed 9 airplanes in one sortie, and probably a couple more, so he was the Navy's largest. He would get the Medal of Honor for that. So this is the 2 largest battleships in the world. The Yamato was the first. It was the Yamato class, and the Musashi. The Japanese had concluded prior to building these 2 battleships that the U.S. would not build a battleship bigger that can pass through the Panama Canal. A ship that size mounts 16-inch guns. They can launch a 2,500 pound projectile about 26 miles. The Yamato, they were designed with 18-inch guns. You can launch, a 3,300 pound projectile even further. But they were so heavily armored, they were too slow to keep up with the carriers, and they burned so much oil that they spent most of the work, their anchorages. And actually, the Battle of Layte Gulf was the first time they would fire their guns in anchor. Now, I mentioned too, the Japanese had attacked one of their airplanes, snuck through in some clouds, jumped out, dropped one 550-pound bomb right in the center of the flight deck of the Princeton. Now, the SEAL of the Princeton looked down, he saw this small round hole and said, well, that's not a problem, we'll just cover it up and we'll be good to go. Unfortunately, that bomb went down just below the hangar deck, detonated there, set a bunch of planes on fire that were fueled and armed, and then the magazines exploded. Now, the cruiser Birmingham, tied up alongside, she was trying to help fight the fires, taking off some of the survivors from Princeton, when a magazine with 100 bombs in it blew. It spelled the end of the Princeton, and actually significant damage to the Birmingham, and she would actually have more casualties than did the Princeton. Now, I have here, and this was written by the executive officer of the Princeton. I really have no words at my command that can adequately describe the veritable splendor and the conduct of all hands, wounded and unwounded. Men with legs off, arms off, with gaping wounds in their sides, with tops of their heads furrowed by fragments, would insist, I'm all right, take care of Joe over there. Or don't waste morphine on me, Commander, just hit me over the head. Terrible as the instruction was, it was a sense of supreme gratification to know the heights of courage and forgetfulness of self to which one's shipmates can rise. And this is only one example. On all the other ships that were damaged, the same sort of thing would happen. It would be a sailor, heavily wounded, would say, hey, don't worry about me, take care of my shipmate, take care of my buddy. Now, coming through is Kurita about 4:15 in the afternoon, turned back around and headed toward the straits. Halsey was convinced that he'd done so much damage to him that there was he was no longer a threat to Leyte Gulf. Now, he based that on his pilot's observations, and pilots are just totally unreliable. What they're usually doing, they're reporting what they thought they saw. A quick look over the shoulder as they're escaping under fire. But as Kurita does come up the way, a scout plane notices that they're headed back to San Bernardino Straits, and that the navigation lights controlled by the Japanese are turned on. So several of Halsey's subordinate commanders are very concerned that it's a mistake to leave San Bernardino Straits unguarded. They contact his flagship, inform him of this, and the reply they received from staff officer, yes, we have that information. What they did with it remains to be seen. Now, Halsey has sent a message out, and this is a fleet-wide message copied by all units, including Kincaid, Admiral Nimitz, and even Admiral King back in D.C. And he says Task Force 34 will be formed. There will be four battleships, 5 cruisers, a bunch of destroyers to guard San Bernardino Straits. So everybody thinks that this task force in the San Bernardino Straits are guarded. But then Halsey gets on his short-range talk between ships radios and tells his own forces this task force will be formed when directed by him, so it is never actually formed. Now down in the Surigao Straits, and I mentioned also how these two didn't like each other and didn't have any communications between them, but, and this is kind of a decoy. Now they're only about 80 miles from as they enter the Straits there. Ollendorf is in charge of the battle force for Kincaid, and he's able to set what's called a trap called crossing the T. Because the straits are so narrow, the Japanese have to come in a column, 4 destroyers out front, followed by the 2 battleships, and then the cruiser Megami behind. Now, so that allows Ollendorf to put his battleships and cruisers broadside time. So the Vietnamese, I'll get it straight. Japanese carriers can only bring their 4 turrets or 4 guns to bear. Ollendorf's force can bring all of their guns to bear. So not only are the Japanese badly outnumbered, they're totally outgunned. Ollendorf also has some 39 PT boats. Now PT boats are fast, but they're very small. They're made of plywood. They did have torpedoes. They all attacked. They launched all their torpedoes and did not get one hit. Okay. Several of the PT boats were damaged by gunfire from the Japanese, and one would go down. But the most important thing the PT boats did is they kept Ollendorf informed of the formation of the Japanese and the position of where they were. Now Ollendorf had also put destroyers on either side, and with their more shallow draft, they were able to hug the shoreline. And since it was nighttime, the Japanese radar would not be able to distinguish them from the mountains and the hills behind them. So and Ollendorf had also told his destroyer COs, do not use your guns, that will give away your position, use only your torpedoes. So they attack multiple heads, and the Fuchsia goes to the bottom. Now, Ollendorf does have one problem. His loadout of weapons is not ideal because he was going to be in support of the landings. Most of his ammo is HE rounds for supporting the troops ashore. He has a limited number of armor-piercing rounds. So he has told both his cruisers and his battleships to wait until they're well within range before they open fire. Now, when they do get within range, this is going to be payback time for 5 of these battleships, because 5 of them were at Pearl Harbor and damaged there. 2 were actually sunk and refloated, and they've been totally upgraded, so they have very accurate targeting radar. So when they do open fire, the Yamashita there is hit by multiple rounds, and she basically disintegrates and is out of sight in just a matter of a few minutes with fewer, if any, survivors. The Megami is also hit and set afire. Now, in 15 minutes, the northern force, the Merchant force, is totally annihilated. Now Shima is coming up behind him. Shima, as I mentioned, they have no communication, so he doesn't know what's going on. He even passes one of the Shima's destroyers that's damaged and doesn't even bother to try to contact, see what's going on. And then they see the Megami, and she is in the last of her 9 lives. She was heavily damaged at the Battle of Midway, rebuilt, and here to fight again, but not for long. But when Shima approaches the Megami, he sees how badly she's hurt, thinks that she's dead in the water. She's actually making way on one screw, and Shima manages to run into her. And then Shima makes what naval historian Samuel S. Morrison called the most intelligent decision of any Japanese commander in the entire battle. He makes a 180 and skedaddles out of the area.
Before you go, could you go back and just show me what you mean by the T, crossing the T?
The T is up here. Okay, they're coming up. The T is up here. Okay, so you've got this up and then a T going across. Okay.
So the defense is...
Yeah, defensive side, and they've got all their guns can bear.
Oh, I see. Okay, got it.
Doesn't have, this is only the second. It'll be the last battleship, the battleship engagement of World II, and it's only the second one. There was another one
I got it.
Okay. Now Korea, he comes out of the Gulf or out of the Straits. It's early morning still, a little before sunrise. He expects to be met by a major force. In fact, it's open seas, and he can't believe it. So he turns south and heads for Leyte Gulf. Now, standing between him and Leyte Gulf are only these escort carriers of Taffy 1, 2, and 3. Taffy 1 is further south. She will be out of the battle because she's too far away. Taffy 3 is closest, and she will actually be the first one to get notification of the Japanese forces. A scout plane just before sunrise, or about sunrise, notifies Admiral Sprague and Taffy 3 that there are 4 battleships, 5 cruisers, and 5 enemy cruisers, and a bunch of destroyers headed to his position at 20 knots. Well, Sprague says, tell that pilot to, re-identify those because, once again, you can't trust pilots, you know. But he thinks they're probably part of Kurita's force that he's seen. But the pilot comes back very quickly and says they have pagoda masts. So there's now no doubt that they are Japanese ships. The Sprague is up to the task. As soon as he gets that information, he tells his carriers all to turn into the wind and launch all aircraft they have, no matter what they've got. Some have depth charges, some have a few bombs, some have some 50mm, some have no ammunition at all, but he tells them all to get airborne. Now the other thing he tells us is the destroyers to make smoke, to mask them from the Japanese, and this turns out to be very valuable. It's kind of a misty morning, so that and the smoke makes a good, thing to hide behind. Now Kurita, as the sun has come up and these masts come across the high, and they have the Japanese are known for their sharp-eyed lookouts, and so they quickly identify these masts as carriers. But the Japanese have no knowledge that the U.S. has these small escort carriers. They think the only thing we have are the large attack carriers. Now that's understandable. They misidentified those. What's less understandable for these lookouts that all the destroyers and destroyer escorts they identify as cruisers. So Narita thinks that he's facing a much larger force, a much more potent force than he actually is. Now as he comes out and gets them inside, he orders what's called a general attack, which basically means every ship do your own thing, proceed independently. And this will prove to be a major mistake because it leads to a disorganized, strung out approach piecemeal. Had he kept them together in an organized battle fashion, he would have been a lot better off. Now there's actually a book called The Last Stand of the Tin Can Sailors, and it's an excellent read. These DEs, they're less than half the size of an attack carrier. They carry 25 to 30 airplanes. They're very thin skinned, and on a good day with a tailwind, they can make about 17 knots, which is half of what some of the cruisers and destroyers of the Japanese fleet can make. And as you can see, the sailors say they stand for combustible, vulnerable, expendable, which is, pretty well true. Now, most of them, the first few are made on freighter hulls, which are very thin. And then Kaiser actually comes out and makes a prototype for them, produces much of the rest of them, which the sailors on those will call Kaiser coffins. Now, Kurita, when he does get the U.S. forces, what he considers this a heaven-sent opportunity, because the Japanese warrior code says you attack other warships. You don't attack, things like amphib ships and supply ships in there. Now, Admiral Sprague, he is on Taffy 3. He's ordering his destroyers to attack the Japanese fleet. The first one is the destroyer Johnson. Her commanding officer is a Commander Evans. He's 3/4 American Indian. And he said at the commissioning of the Johnson, he told his crew, if any of you don't want to go in harm's way, get off the ship. And none of them did. He had also been a crewman on a destroyer in the early Battle of Japanese where they had to retreat. He added to his crew, I will never again retreat. And he proved true to his word. So he was the first one to attack, doing what they call chasing salvos. As he went up to zigzag, as a shell misses, you steer toward that salvo thinking the enemy will correct when the salvo will miss you again. And he does get within range. He fires a spread of torpedoes, actually takes a large chunk out of the lead cruiser, which it will have to drop out of action. And it creates some more confusion for the Japanese because the commander of their cruiser is on that ship and he'll have to transfer flagships. Behind Johnson come the Hoyle and another destroyer and a destroyer escort. They're steaming toward the Japanese. Johnston has turned around, and she has been heavily damaged by her bridge has been totally wiped out. Commander Evans actually has his uniform shirt blown off, and he has 2 fingers cut, which he quickly wraps a rag around him, and he tells the medical personnel, don't bother me right now. And he has lost steering control, so he's back on the back of the ship, the fantail, and he's yelling down through an open hatch, steering directions to the sailors that are manually turning the rudder. So as the Hoyle and the others pass him, he orders left full rudder, and he's going to fall in behind him. The only thing he has left firing is a little 5-inch gun. Now Hoyle also manages to get within range. She fires a spread of torpedoes and hits one other cruiser, but the most important thing that happens, 2 of them hit toward the super battleship Yamato. And when their lookouts spy them, why the Yamato makes a hard 180 turn running away from them, and she will have to stay for probably about 10 minutes, although Admiral Kurita said it seemed like an hour, because the torpedoes are on either side, they're running it basically the same way. So he has to wait until the torpedoes run out of steam before he can turn back into flight, which saves precious minutes for the U.S. Oops. Now, in the meantime, Sprague has made good use of the smoke. He's also went into a rain squall for about 20 minutes, was sealed in, because the Japanese radars were not all that accurate. They needed visual, to be that good. They will, after the Hoyle fires her torpedo, she turns broadside and she'll pay the price. She's hit by multiple rounds from both the battleships and the cruisers. She will survive for some time, but she will go down before too long. Also, the destroyer escort Roberts is hit by 14-inch gunfire, and she being small, she will also head to the deep. Now, the destroyer escort, they have been heavily damaged, and most of them, even the Fanshawe Bay, which is Sprague's flagship, they've been hit. In some cases, the armor-piercing rounds proved to be a help to them, because with the thin skin, in some cases, they just go in one side right out the other side, and they never detonate. But they do have a delayed fuse on some of their battleship 14-inch guns. The idea, and it works, they'll hit the water. They will actually have a delay go underneath the ships and then detonate underneath the hull. So in several cases, this lifted some of these little destroyer escorts out of the water in the back end, and of course caused major damage, which most of them were able to contain through excellent damage control. But it looks like the Gamber Bay is about in her last stages. She is heavily under attack. She is now, in all these destroyer escorts have in the way of offensive on the ship. There's one 5-inch gun that's clear on the back on the fantail. But they're finally able to fire, and they actually hit a few cruisers and do some damage. In the meanwhile, all the airplanes from both Taffy 3 and Taffy 2 have attacked. They attacked with whatever they have. Some just have depth charges, because their real job was for ASW patrol and for support for the ships ashore. They do some fairly serious damage. Those with their machine guns, they make strafing runs, and when they run out of ammo, they make dummy runs. And the torpedo airplanes, they don't have a torpedo in some cases, so they'll just open their on bay doors and make dummy runs, making the Japanese think, in fact, they're under attack. So this proves quite effective for it. But it looks like the end is coming for the Gamber Bay. She's been heavily hit by gunfire. The Johnson, by this time, has come back into play, and Commander Evans issues one of the most forceful orders of the entire battle. He tells his gunnery officer, fire on that cruiser and pull her attention away from the Gamber Bay onto me. But it's actually a little much too late. The Gamber Bay finally goes down. She will be the only U.S. carrier to ever be sunk by naval gunfire. And the Johnson also is in her final throes, and Evans finally orders a abandon ship. The sailors in the water watch a cruiser that slowly approaches with apprehension. They expect to be a machine gun in the water, but actually some of the Japanese sailors throw some little packets of fluid. And then the survivors watch in amazement as a Japanese officer on the bridge stands at attention and salutes as the Johnson takes her final plunge. Now at this point though, Admiral Sprague, when this first started, said he saw the Japanese fleet, he said, I think we'll probably last about 15 minutes. But with keeping what's called a stern chase, where they have to go the further distance, why he's managed to survive for over 2 hours. But now it looks like their luck is about run out. But suddenly the Japanese guns, they go silent, and the Japanese fleet turns away. And that causes a sailor on the signalman on flagship to yell, damn it, they're getting away. So why did he turn around? Well, Kurita, even in interrogations after the war, gave conflicting reasons. Initially he said, well, he was pretty sure the landings were over and he couldn't really do any damage if he got in the Leyte Gulf. And that would be true, but he had no way of knowing that. He also said that he thought that there was a force to the north of him because of the gauge. And actually there has, but it was Halsey's up there. And of course he was so far away. Now, Halsey, both Sprague and Kincaid had made increasingly, desperate calls to Halsey for support, telling him what kind of shape they were in. But as the Japanese fleet did go away, there's still 2 ships to be damaged. This is the first use of their Special Attack Corps, otherwise known as kamikaze pilots. The first organized use of them. They will attack, they will damage 2 of the escort carriers, but the St. Lo is the first U.S. carrier to be sunk by kamikaze suicide attacks. Now the St. Lo, 2 weeks earlier, had been named the USS Midway. After the Battle of Midway, they named her in commemoration of the battle. When the present Midway was on the drawing boards, they wanted to name their biggest warship after the biggest victory. So they changed the name to the escort carrier to St. Lo. Now back in the sailing days, when ships were wood and men were iron, why sailors were very superstitious. And one of the biggest superstitions was bad luck would rename your ship. So in this case, it proved to be true. Now Halsey, in the meanwhile, he'd received these messages and they came in out of order because of the overload. And he expressed, he said he was surprised that Kincaid had actually let this happen. But the other one that's very concerned is Admiral Nimitz. And he is very good about staying out of things with his on-scene commanders, trusting to their judgment. Finally, even he has to weigh in because he doesn't know where Task Force 34 is. So he sends out this message, where is, and repeat is for emphasis, where is, repeat, Task Force 34. Now that's the message he wants sent, but when the communicators get it, they put nonsensical padding for communication security on either end, and it's separated by a double constant. Well, it says, as the turkey trots, GG, where is, repeat, Task Force 34, are the world wonders. Well, when this comes in the communication shack on New Jersey, the communicators are supposed to remove that padding. And they do remove the front padding, but for some reason they don't take off this as the world wonders. So when it's given to Halsey, he flies into a rage. He says, what right does Chester have to send me a message like this? He throws it to the deck, throws his hats down, he's stomping out, he's totally out of control, so much that his chief of staff grabs him and says, what's wrong with you? Get a hold of yourself. And they hustle him off to the admiral's cabin. And they're in that cabin for almost an hour. When they do come back, Halsey has finally settled down. He says, I hate to let go of something when I have my teeth in it, but he does order his ships to turn around, or his battleships and cruisers to turn around. Now, had he made that order when they first got these messages an hour earlier, he would have had a good chance of trapping Kurita as he came out of the eastern end of the straits. But that extra hour made the difference that he could not even catch Kurita. After the war, Halsey would maintain the only mistake he made during the battle was turning around. He never would admit that leaving the straits unguarded was a mistake. Now, the last carrier of the Japanese to be sunk was the Zuikaku, the last carrier to attack Pearl Harbor. And as you can see here, the list she's in, the crew is saluting as their flag is ordered, and they're playing their national anthem. So what are the final casualties? Well, as you know, 11 warships, Princeton, of course, the escort carriers, Hoyle and the Johnston, and a destroyer escort. The same would be a Roberts that went down in a hurry after she was hit with 14-inch gunfire. And the one PT boat. Now, 4 others damaged, including the USS Darter, one of the submarines. And it was a dark, overcast night when they were attacking, and so they only had dead reckoning. They couldn't get a good position. The Darter ran hard aground, so hard that her crews were actually up out of the water. They set their demolition charges, which failed to explode for some reason. So they had to take the whole crew on board the Dance, or the Darter, and that wreckage still sits there today. So if you want to go to the Philippines, I guess you can go see it anyway. But you know, World War II submarines were very small, very cramped to start with. So with a double crew on this submarine, it was not a comfortable trip as they headed back to their base in Australia. And more than 1,600 sailors were killed, but this would have been much worse if it were not for Captain Charles Adair. He was a planner on the admiral's staff, and he was, as he was working, he saw a notice come up about survivors, and he wondered if there was any rescue operation in place. He quickly found out there wasn't, so he organized a rescue operation with primarily small landing craft type ships. And they set out in the day. They wanted to get there in the daytime so they wouldn't run over any at night. Due to some garbled coordinates, they head in the wrong direction. It would be nighttime before they got there, but they would rescue some 1,200 survivors, which probably would not have survived another night in the water. Now, as for the Japanese victory operation, it didn't quite turn out that way. So you can see the last large carrier, all the cruisers, the battleships. So their number of casualties is actually unknown. It's estimated in the 10 to 12,000 range. But the Japanese Navy at that time would cease to exist as an offensive force. Now, I always have to pitch Midway. you haven't been over there for a while, we do have one new event, the CEIC Inside Naval Intelligence. It's a new exhibit. It just opened recently. Our CEO is kind of his brainchild. He flew in A6s in Desert Storm. So they have a whole planning operation, go and try to plan a strike in Desert Storm. As mentioned, I've flown over 2 on combat missions. I played that 3 times and I failed miserably all 3 times, so it's kind of a hard one to play. And we're also, like you all, looking for volunteers. We welcome anybody. We tell them too that military experience is not required. Actually, civilians have a definite advantage. They still speak civilian, you know. Not like us, they don't have very good. There is a poem that goes with the battle. It's called In the Watery Depths. If I can remember it now. In watery depths, no poppies blow, no crosses stand in order to grow. Their young hearts sleep beneath the wave, the spirit of the good, the brave. And stars their constant vigil keep for them who lie beneath the deep. 'Tis true you cannot kneel in prayer at a certain spot and think he's there. But you can to the ocean go, see whitecaps marching row on row. No one for him will always ride in and out with every tide. And when your span of life is past, they'll meet you at the captain's mast. And those who mourn on distant shore for sailors who come home no more can dry their tears and pray for these that rest beneath the heaving seas. For stars that shine and winds that blow, and whitecaps marching row on row, and they can no longer lonely be, for when they live, they chose the sea. And with that, if you got any questions, I have all sorts of answers. They may not be questions. Yes, sir.
Yeah, you know, we have a really nice, have you seen that model of you have the Gambier Bay?
I remember you told me about that, yes.
Okay, so you got, and then
Yeah, that's
thinking
the
of
only way I would
the
have.
San Juan.
I wouldn't want to have been on one of those. Anybody else? Well, thank
Did
you
you
for
guys survive
coming.
the ramming attack yesterday?
Pardon?
Did you survive the ramming attack yesterday?
Yeah, that's pretty amazing. They just painted that side of the ship too.
Yeah.
So our chief engineer. And we had, a while back, we had a sailboat come in, and it hit the horns that stick out in front of the vital masters, demasted itself. And a friend of mine happened to be the one that had rented out the sailboat. And so I said, well, what the guy said? He said, well, I was trying to get a real close look. Well, he obviously got a real close look. And then they tried to blame Midway and tried to sue Midway for the damage to the sailboat. I don't think Midway's moved much.
For being part of it.
Anything else? Yes, sir.
Thanks, Rick.
The center force was the main force. Why did it include any carriers? Were they just planning on relying on?
Well, they did, the carriers, they had no pilots, okay? Basically, the pilots, they had not had time to train them. At best, they could take off, they couldn't land. So they were gonna be the decoy force up there, which they were successful. And that's one thing I didn't mention, when Halsey did give that, notification, they finally found out, well, he headed north. And, he actually was out in front with his battleship. And this was something he had wanted since his days as cadet, a major battle. He had missed out on the Battle of Midway because he had shingles, was out. He had missed out on Guadalcanal. And so he was after this, and he considered this, his biggest disappointment. Anything else? All right. Well, thank you very much.
Thanks, Ray.
You're welcome. Very good.
Okay, we will do this in August.